This morning's talk is called Two Threats to the Christian Worldview, New Atheism and Religious Pluralism. And it's part of a series, so we'll be here together again tomorrow as well, called Ideas Matter, Advocating a Christian Worldview. And in some sense, this is a talk that it might be a little bit jarring for some of you. I mean, we just had this amazing time of worship together where we are pouring our heart out. We're open to hearing what God wants to do in and to us, for us, through us. And then now we're going to shift gears, and that might be jarring for some of you, but I actually think that what we're going to do today is an extension of what we were doing earlier. One of the first songs, if you saw me playing on my phone, I wasn't texting anyone. I was taking notes about one of the lyrics. One of the lyrics in the earlier song said, closer and closer we want to know you. And what this series is going to be about today and tomorrow is another way in which we can know God. How maybe a way that's not fully appreciated as it should be. So this morning we were pursuing God with all of our heart and all of our soul, and that's great. We should never stop doing that. But sometimes we don't take as seriously the part of pursuing God with our mind. And so what we're going to do today, I really do see as an extension of how we can come closer and closer, how we can get to know God in a deeper and more meaningful way. And so that's what we are going to do today. But before we begin, I know we've prayed a lot, but it's never hurts to pray a little bit more. So if you would join with me in prayer, I would appreciate it. Dear God, we are so grateful for all of the great and wonderful things that you have done for us. We recognize that you didn't have to do anything for us, yet you saw us in our sin and provided a way of reconciliation. We are so thankful for that. I pray for our time this morning. I pray that you will enable me to explain these ideas in a way that is meaningful and helpful to the students who are here. I pray anything that I say that would detract from their devotion to you, anything that is false or untrue, I just ask by your Spirit they quickly forget those things. At the same time, the things that we discuss, that we talk about, that are true, I pray that your Spirit will just embed those deeply within each individual person so that it can shape and form who they are, so they can be better, more equipped ministers of your gospel. We thank you for being among us. We thank you that that we know that this will be a more productive morning as a result of having asked you to bless it. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. One last quick thing before we get started. We're going to do a lot in a short amount of time, and there's probably going to be questions that you have about all sorts of various things, and that's great. So I'm going to be in the cafeteria at lunch and just hanging out. So if you want to come and chat about any of these things or things that might be related or whatever, feel free. I'll be there. I think Dr. Rosedal and Dr. Magruder will be there with me as well. So come and join us. You can find us amongst all of the fair food somewhere in the cafeteria. So now, unless you've been living under a rock for the last several years, you're probably aware that the Christian worldview is increasingly coming under attack in a variety of different ways. For a while, it seemed like there was a movement in culture where there was a growing acceptance of things that we as Christians take to be wrong or sinful. There was a growing acceptance of things that we took to be hurtful to the Christian worldview. And that certainly hasn't changed. But what has changed is it seems like our society, or this culture in which we find ourselves, has shifted gears a little bit, where it's now not just accepting those kinds of ideas, those kinds of beliefs, those kinds of practices. It's actually promoting them. It's encouraging people to pursue this way of thinking or this way of living that runs contrary to the Christian scriptures. This is why it's not uncommon to see Christian truth claims regularly mocked or made fun of, questioned in all various types of media and even the press. And so we as Christians, we need to think about how do we respond in this sort of environment. I mean, we have, there's a couple of things that we could do. We could simply, kind of wash our hands of culture, of contemporary society, and just retreat back into our own communities, or we can engage that culture. And hopefully you know which one I'm going to advocate. Otherwise, if the retreat option leads to a really short talk, right? That would be done very quickly if that's all we were going to do. So I think we need to learn how do we engage this culture that is increasingly anti-Christian. How do we go about doing that? And one of the things I hope that you start to seriously consider, or if you maybe consider more thoroughly, is that one of the things that's often left out whenever we talk about engaging culture is the importance of engaging the ideas that undergird the hostility to the Christian faith that we see. These ideas, it is ideas that is leading this hostility. And so we need to be ministers of the gospel that cares about people's needs. We need to provide them, be compassionate. We need to provide them with various services, things like that. That's all good. We should do that. But doing that alone never gets to one of the root problems, and that is people have false ideas about Christianity. They have false ideas about what it is that we believe. They have false ideas that run contrary, and it's those ideas that we need to shape. A former professor of mine once said, "The ideas are the rails on which our lives run." And I think it's a great image that what you believe about something will determine how you act in regards to those things. And so whenever we see that there are false ideas, we need to recognize those ideas, call them out for being false, and help people see why they are false and what they should be replaced with. Okay? So that's sort of, broadly speaking, what we're going to do. This morning, we're going to look at two specific threats to the Christian worldview. The first is what comes from a group of people known as the New Atheists. I don't know if this is a title they've given themselves or not, but it's common for people to refer to the New Atheists. Now, as soon as we say new atheists, you're probably thinking, well, who are the old atheists, or what's the difference between the old atheists? And so just to help get clear on who I have in mind here, the older sort of atheists, they've been around for as long as we have recorded history, and they would typically reject Christianity for various reasons. Maybe because of the problem of evil. Maybe they look around at all of the different religious faiths and say, how could you ever know? And there's various reasons they might reject the truth of Christianity. What was also true about most of these old atheists is they didn't really care about what you and I thought or believed. They thought we were irrational. I mean, don't get me wrong. They thought we were wrong and maybe even irrational for believing that there is a God, but it didn't really bother them all that much. It was only whenever we tried to convert them that they cared what we believed. Now, the new atheists, though, take a different tact. The new atheists are much more evangelistic and strident in their non-belief. The new atheists don't just think that we're irrational, some even think that it's immoral for us to believe that there is a God. They are much more strident. So in Toronto for a little while, there was a campaign that went through, a bus campaign, where a bunch of these people got a bunch of money together and took out ads to put on the sides of the bus that said, "There probably is no God, so just deal with it and get on with your life." Right? Like they're active. They're encouraging people to give up their belief because they think that religion is so fundamentally problematic. And we'll see some examples of that in just a minute. So now, why do we care about these sorts of people, though? They're out there, but why is that worthy of talking about in a context like this? Well, I think it's because, or one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it was these new atheists are forming a movement. There are lots and lots of other people who are buying in to their way of seeing the world. They're buying into what their sort of method for coming to truths about the world, and it's impacting them. So you're going to have, when you go home for the holiday, you're going to have siblings, family members, neighbors who have probably in some way or another begun to adopt the kinds of things that they are advocating. And you need to be able to recognize it for what it is so you can address it properly. So just to put a bit of context on who these people are, there's a whole bunch of them, but some of the more prominent ones is someone like Richard Dawkins. So I don't know if you've ever heard of Richard Dawkins or not, but he wrote a really popular book called The God Delusion. The last time I checked, it was reported that there were over 2 million copies of it were sold in English alone. It was number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list. It spent 51 weeks on that list overall. Number 2 on Amazon.com's bestsellers list. So it's a very, very popular book. Lots of people were picking this up. So what does Dawkins have to say to us Christians? Well, here's a oft-cited quote from Dawkins. He writes in The God Delusion, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, capriciously malevolent bully. Okay. So 51 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, and that's his description of the God that we just spent 15 minutes pouring our hearts out to. We need to think, we need to know how, when we hear those sorts of things in the coffee shops, in our neighborhoods, how do we respond to them? He also, in another context, and I hope he was kidding, but I don't think he was, he said this, quote, "To label a child Catholic or Protestant or Jewish is always a form of child abuse. Maybe some children need to be protected from indoctrination by their own parents." These are the sorts of ideas that are growing or becoming more common. Take, for example, another person, Sam Harris, in his book called The End of Faith. You know, he's not quite as popular as Dawkins. He was only 33 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list. But he says in his book, The End of Faith, that every religion preaches the truth of propositions for which no evidence is even conceivable. So whenever we say something like, Jesus is divine, that's a proposition. Jesus is divine. It's a proposition I hope we all think is true. For Harris, though, that's a proposition, saying Jesus is divine. That's something that you could not give any kind of evidence for the truth of that claim. No evidence, according to him, is even conceivable. Just one more example. Christopher Hitchens, in his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, you can imagine how that's going to go. That was number one on Amazon's list, and it was also hit number one on the New York Times list in its very first week. He says, the Bible indeed does contain a warrant for trafficking in humans, for ethnic cleansing, for slavery, for bride price, and for indiscriminate massacre. But we are not bound by any of it because it was put together by crude, uncultured human mammals. Okay. So quickly, we won't do this today, but these sorts of quotes gives you a really good reason to pay attention in your hermeneutics courses, because most of those claims just come from bad exegesis. All right, so getting the hankies out over there. But there's other things going on, and that's what we'll focus on. You can talk with the professors in hermeneutics for that, but it is an important aspect of it. Okay, so what do we think about these new atheists? How do we go about responding to them? Well, we have to get clear on the sorts of things they believe, and so it's always difficult whenever you try to describe an entire group very quickly, but I think what I'm going to say that these sorts of people believe is true of people who call themselves or be considered new atheists. There may be some exceptions, but I can't think of any. First is a commitment to some kind of physicalism or naturalism, we could call it. This is the view that there are no gods, or there's no God or gods, however you want to consider it. There's no soul, there are no minds. We as human persons, we are just physical things. There's no immaterial aspect to us. There's nothing non-material. So in kind of an easy way to understand naturalism is by what it denies. It's the denial of supernaturalism, right? It's just the natural world. These kinds of things is all that exists. Bits and matter, that's the sort of thing. That's all that exists. Now, that commitment to naturalism is true of both old and new atheists. That's not unique, though it's common, and it's something to keep in mind. What's different about these new atheists is they kind of build onto that something else. And it's what we could call a commitment to scientism. Scientism. This is the view, scientism is the view that only science is capable of revealing truths about the world. If you can't run an experiment on something of some sort, if you can't employ the scientific method, then whatever to determine whether something's true or not, well, it's just really up for grabs. It's only through the sciences, the hard sciences in particular, that we get truth. This is why, for Harris, religion is intrinsically dangerous, because it makes all of these claims that you can't test scientifically, right? This is why, for Harris, no evidence is even conceivable. Take the claim Jesus is divine. What sort of test would you run? How would you employ the scientific method to figure out if that claim is true? Well, you couldn't. And so for Harris, then, there is no evidence that could count for it. This is why in a recent book, he has attempted to derive a system of ethics. We talked about this today in Dr. Rosedal's class this morning. He tries to get a system of ethics simply from looking at the sciences. And if you want to laugh a bit, look at some of the reviews of his books by even non-Christian philosophers, and everybody is pretty much agreed that that project is a failure. But, he tried. That's okay. So we have this commitment to naturalism and a commitment to scientism. And I do want to be very clear about one thing. Almost no serious philosophical atheists will be committed to this scientism. So I don't want to caricature other people's views. But the people that you're probably going to run into in the coffee shops aren't reading serious philosophical atheists. They're reading these new atheist guys. And the new atheists, it turns out, tend to be really bad at philosophy. And so that's okay. That's good for us because then we have a way of responding to their bad arguments. But don't think that all atheism amounts to naturalism and scientism. I just want to be very clear about that. Okay, so we have this commitment to scientism. Science itself is the sole arbiter of truth. What do we think about that? Well, the first thing I want to note is that there's a good chance that a lot of you, in some way or another, have actually incorporated part of that commitment to scientism into your own worldview. That you actually probably, in some way or another, have bought into that. Not on purpose, and certainly not as it relates to your Christianity, but you have bought into it in other ways. For example, for example, how many of you have ever been up late watching TV and you see the infomercial come on, and right before you can flip the channel, the guy comes out and he's always wearing like a white lab coat so he can sell pots and pans or like a new knife or, a window repair kit for your car or something, or some face cream, right? Why is the guy in a lab coat? Was he like rushing and working in his lab and said, "Oh, I got to film the commercial. I don't have time to change"? No, that's not why he's in the lab coat. Why is he in the lab coat? Well, because the lab coat gives a sense of, oh, look, the scientist has spoken. This window repair tool must really work, right? The scientist has spoken. This is the best face cream you could ever imagine. And if that sort of way of reasoning, or that sort of way if that didn't work, advertisers would stop using it, but they just keep doing it more and more and more because many of us ourselves are inclined to think, oh, well, if somebody in the sciences says it, then it must be true. The same applies in sort of the medical profession as well, and this is why many very committed Christian couples who are expecting a child and find out that there's a good chance the child might have Down syndrome, they will oftentimes really struggle with whether or not they should abort their child. Why? Because more often than not, their doctor is going to say to them, you should just abort this child and try again. And there's this idea, well, there's my doctor in the lab coat, got the diplomas on the wall, what he says or what she says about this must be true. And we can inadvertently allow it to have undue influence in how we evaluate that decision. Right? Now, just as a quick aside, you should note that isn't a medical decision that the doctor is making. It's an ethical one, and going to med school doesn't mean you're good at making ethical decisions. That's just a quick aside. But I know of people who have struggled with this themselves because they see the influence of somebody from the sciences. One more example. In 2012, the Journal of Medical Ethics published an article that advocated for the permissibility of post-birth abortions. That basically is the right to terminate the newly unborn. Now, this rightly generated lots and lots of discussion among both pro-life and pro-choice camps. People were blogging about it and protesting, and all the big furor was created as a result of this article being published. Here's what's important for our context, though. That exact same argument was given by Michael Tooley, who's a philosopher in Colorado, over 40 years ago, and nobody cared. Why? Well, because nobody really cares what philosophers have to say. That might be part of it. But because though Tooley is, Dr. Tooley, he's not the right kind of doctor. He's not the scientist or the medical doctor, and so it was easy to dismiss the crazy philosopher. The same argument comes out in the Journal of Medical Ethics, and now all of a sudden, we all care. Now, Christians even care. Whereas before, philosophers have known about this argument. They publish on it, they write on it, they talk on it all the time, but nobody ever cares. It shows up in medical ethics. Now we do care. I think it's because even we Christians can buy into this idea that science has a privileged role in coming to understand truths about the world in which we live in. So we overemphasize science. Okay. And so how do we respond to this? How do we respond to this commitment to scientism? Well, you might be tempted to say, well, look, science is wrong sometimes, a lot of times science is wrong. And so maybe we should devalue the role of science. We shouldn't really care about it. We should distance ourselves from science because of these sorts of things. And, science can be wrong. There was an article in The Atlantic recently that said there was a certain journal had surveyed over 2,000 retractions in scientific journals, and over 67% of them were due to some sort of misconduct, right? So maybe there's something to that scientists can be led by their preconceived biases going into something. But I don't think distancing ourselves from the sciences is the way to go. I think instead we need to look at what's undergirding that commitment to science. We need to get to the root cause. Just ignoring it isn't going to really help anything. Our friends and family who still believe it, that's not going to help them any. We need to figure out what really this commitment to scientism amounts to. So remember that the operating assumption for those committed to scientism is that only science gets us to truth about the world, right? That's the sort of operating assumption. Well, what you want to do is immediately ask something about that assumption. Right? Some of you already know where this is going. It's not overly deep. What we want to ask is that assumption itself something that you get via the sciences? Is the claim that we only get truth via the sciences something that you generate via a lab? Well, no, it's not. That claim is not a scientific claim, yet it's taken to be true. What that tells us is that maybe there are other ways in which you can come to truths about the world. Surely you can come to truth about the world through the sciences, but there are other ways as well. Maybe there are ways like philosophical ways of coming to truths about the world. The problem with scientism is that it doesn't meet its own standard. The claim itself is not a scientific claim. It's something else. So once we recognize that, and you help the people you're talking with recognize that should open their minds to the possibility that there are other ways we can come to truths about the world in which we live. So for example, maybe there's philosophical evidence for God's existence. Maybe you have a moral argument for God's existence. Or tomorrow in Dr. Magruder's apologetics course, we're going to talk about the Kalam argument. Or maybe that's today in Dr. Rosedal's class. I'm getting everything confused. But you have maybe a cosmological argument for God's existence. Maybe there's historical evidence from the reliability of the New Testament to think that Jesus is divine. Right? That's not a scientific claim, but maybe you can establish it historically. Maybe you can establish it via testimonial evidence, through the teachings of the church down through history. Or maybe even there is something like experiential evidence. Your own personal relationship with God can count as a type of evidence. Once you open up the realm of evidence to things that aren't simply scientific, now you have the room to begin to having a lot more meaningful discussions about the Christian God that we know and love. Okay, so that's the first sort of claim. The second one, the second threat, is kind of a different sort. So the new atheists and their commitment to scientism is sort of a direct attack against Christianity, right? It's immoral to train up your children to be Christians. We should. It's a direct affront to the truth of Christianity. The second claim, however, is a little bit different. It's not really an attempt to directly attack the truth of Christianity. Instead, it serves to sort of undermine the truth of Christianity. This second threat comes from what I call religious pluralism. And this commitment, this society's commitment to religious pluralism is a bit sneakier in how it serves as a threat to Christianity. So quickly though, what I don't mean so sometimes it's helpful to talk about what you don't mean before you talk about what you do mean. When I talk about religious pluralism, I don't mean that the growing number of people leaving Christianity for other religious traditions. That's not what I'm talking about. That's a threat. That's a problem. It's something we should be able and equipped and ready to deal with. But that's not what I mean by religious pluralism. I don't mean just people becoming Muslim or becoming Hindu or something like that. I mean, we can all see that in action, and I mean, that's noticeable, so I don't think I need to spend too much time on that. That's not what I mean. I also don't mean that in rejecting religious pluralism that we shouldn't care about how to live in a pluralistic society. It's just true that in a society like this, there's a lot of people from a lot of different religious traditions. That's just true. We do need to learn how to live in that society, but what's important is we need to learn how to live in that society in such a way that is consistent with the tenets of the Christian worldview. So what do I mean by religious pluralism? Well, this is the view that there is no single religious tradition that provides a means of salvation. There is a plurality of ways that one might be saved. Now, for most of you, I'm hoping at least, you recognize this is not what has been traditionally believed by Christians. We could cite numerous texts, but John 8:24, I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am He, you will die in your sins, right? Unless you believe I am He, you will die. It seems like Jesus is saying, believing in me is important, right? So maybe there's not other ways. In Acts, we see something similar, right? Acts 4:12, we'll just start at 12 for the sake of time. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven among men by which we must be saved. That seems pretty clear, right? There's no other name by which we must be saved. So it seems like the traditional Christian teaching is clear. How are we saved? Through Jesus alone. Religious pluralism says, no, there are multiple ways to salvation. Where does that come from? Where does that idea come from? You probably have seen this sort of maybe an implicit commitment to religious pluralism in your own lives. How many of you have heard of someone say something like this to you? I'm glad that being a Christian works for you. It just didn't work for me. I tried it didn't work for me. Has anybody ever heard somebody say, I'm glad that works for you, but kind of get off my case, it didn't work for me, that kind of a thing? Well, the implication seems to be something like this. The truth of Christianity depends upon whether or not it works for some person, right? Maybe you've heard something like this. Look, don't harp on me about becoming a Christian. All that really matters is that your religion leads you to be a better person who tries to help others. How many of you have heard something like that? All that really matters for religion is whether or not it's helping you help others, right? So the implication here is that the truth of a religion amounts to whether or not it helps you help others. Well, unfortunately, this sort of commitment to religious pluralism can even be found within the Christian community. So this is something that Brian McLaren has advocated in his book, A New Kind of Christianity. There he says, look, it's not about, God doesn't care about us having the right beliefs about Jesus or the Trinity, etc. He doesn't care about that. What he cares about is how you treat others. That's what God cares about. So in describing the final judgment, what happens in the final judgment, here's what McLaren says. He says, quote, God will examine the story of our lives for signs of Christ-likeness, for a cup of cold water or a plate of hot food given to one in need, for an atom of mercy shown to one who has been unkind or unthoughtful, for a visit to a prisoner or an open door and a warm bed for a stranger, for a generous impulse indulged and a hurtful one denied, like Jesus. Well, will God look for those kinds of things? Well, probably, but notice what's missing in this account of the final judgment. There's nothing about forgiveness or atonement or redemption or sin. That seems to be an important part of the Christian worldview. But McLaren ignores that to focus on how we treat one another. And what I think is happening here is he's bought into this notion that the truth of a religion simply matters, is dependent upon whether or not it helps you help others, that's all that matters. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. Sometimes you see it in various religious studies departments. It's usually secular universities. But there's a big poster. It's got like a wheel, and it has like the golden rule as it appears in all of these various traditions, right? So, there's the golden rules. It appears for Christians, for Hindus, for Muslims, and it goes all the way across. And the implication of this sort of this poster is, look, all the religions are basically saying the same thing, so let's stop fighting and get on with each other, right? We're all basically saying, be nice to each other. They're all committed to the same sort of thing. That commitment to religious pluralism, in my view, is what is serving to undermine the uniqueness of Christianity. And it's robbing us of the ability to advocate what makes Christianity true. What makes it, why we are Christians, why God cares for a relationship with us. This commitment to religious pluralism is undermining it. So see, it's not a direct attack because they don't say your religion is wrong. They say your religion is no more true than mine. So let's just be happy with each other. Let's just hold hands and everything will be okay. Oh, well, where do we go from here? How do we respond to that? Well, what needs to be more clearly articulated, and this is especially true for, I think, people in a setting like this, is that, yes, it's true that God does care deeply about how we treat one another. But what needs to be more clearly articulated is that that's not all he cares about. Even if it's true that other religious systems are primarily concerned with how we treat one another, that's not what Christianity is primarily concerned about. These advocates of religious pluralism have mistakenly bought into the idea that Christianity is an ethical system, that Christianity is primarily concerned about teaching how to live. And that's not what Christianity is primarily concerned with. Christianity is primarily a salvific system. Christianity is about how one is saved. Now, as a result of being saved, as a result of recognizing your sin and going to God, asking forgiveness, doing your best to live as Christ did, when you do that, you will begin to live differently. You will begin to treat people kindly. You will begin to live this ethical life, but it comes as a result from your salvation. It's not the same as your salvation. So if salvation is about right relationship with God, well, now it's not arrogant to say the Muslim and the Hindu are not saved according to their traditions because their traditions don't provide the way to have that right relationship with God. This is something that whenever is easily overlooked whenever you're doing your outreach programs, when you're going on the mission field, whenever you're going down to Deep Ellum. I'm assuming you guys still do that. Go, provide for people, help them, but you can't forget that won't ever amount to their being saved, right? Do it. It's important, but it's not just that. Having a relationship with God will lead you to treat others differently than you would have had you not had that relationship with God, right? It's that go the extra mile idea. But behaving that way doesn't equate to salvation. Instead, it follows from it. I'll stop there. There's more that could be said about both New Atheism and religious pluralism, but I welcome you to come and chat with me in the cafeteria. So I'll turn it over to you. So thank you so much for your time. Tomorrow we'll pick up on some related ideas. Yeah.